did think it was a nice title for my book. But thank you very much. I'd like to say thank you to Tim for inviting me to be here today. It's a real pleasure and a real honour to be here and giving this lecture today. And thank you all for coming along to listen. It's great to see so many faces in the audience, and hello to the folks listening online as well. Okay, so I probably don't need to tell you all, I think, because most of you have at least got an interest in VR or are working in that area. So I probably don't need to tell you that in recent years, virtual reality has been embraced by storytellers working in fiction and documentary or hybrid realms to create memorable, immersive experiences. So in this lecture, I'm going to examine a number of case studies to look at how creators have approached VR as a narrative format and raise questions about the specificity of the format. So this is part of my ongoing research into writing for VR, and when I use the term writing, I'm using it as sort of an umbrella term for all sorts of practices for conceptualizing and developing virtual reality narratives. So just to tell you a bit more about what I'm going to talk about over the next 45 minutes or an hour, or I'm not quite sure. Hopefully it won't go for longer than an hour. We'll see. So just for those of you that may not be across, what's been going on in the last decade or so, I'll start with a very brief sort of bit of a history and state of play for VR storytelling, and then talk a bit about some current trends that can be noted. And this is part of this book that just came out last year, where I sort of was looking at VR storytelling for the last 5 years, really since COVID hit in 2020. And some of the trends that I noticed looking at a whole bunch of different VR experiences. And then I'm going to talk a bit about rethinking mise-en-scène for VR storytelling. So looking at that sort of concept taken from film studies and how we can sort of rethink it in the wake of VR. And then lastly, I'll talk about environmental storytelling as one means through which we can achieve that. Environmental storytelling, some of you might be familiar with, is a concept drawn from theme park and video game discourse. And so I'll be talking that and unpacking that a bit more in relation to some of the VR case studies that I'll present. And ultimately, what I'm aiming to do here is further explore the specificity and the potential of storytelling in VR, noting current challenges and opportunities for writers or creators. Just a little bit about my background for those of you who weren't in the workshop yesterday. So yeah, I came to VR as an academia, as a filmmaker. I worked as a freelance writer, director, and editor for a period of time before I went back and did my PhD. And my PhD was in traditional film, looking at French cinema actually, and female directors and cinema of the body. And then in about 2016 or early 2017, I watched my first VR film and just completely was blown away by the possibilities of what could be done with VR, and had all sorts of questions about how do you even start to create something and plan a work for this new format. So that's sort of how I got into it. But I came from a background as a researcher in the sort of creative practice research space, looking at script development, screenwriting, screen media, and embodiment. And it's taken me a while to realize that's sort of the common thread, I guess, running through all of my research activities in traditional media and also VR is this exploration of embodiment. Just click that person.
Not meeting some.
Haven't seen that one before. Is that an AI issue? Deny. Okay, so moving on. So I thought I'd just start with some definitions of virtual reality for those that may not be researching in this area. There's lots of different definitions of what VR is. There's lots of opinions on what VR is and what VR isn't, but these are a few different definitions that I've come back to again and again. Firstly, from Shin, that it is a computer-generated experience that can simulate physical presence in real or imagined environments. And in talking about presence, Riva and all have talked about presence being a complex, multi-dimensional perception that's formed through an interplay of raw, multisensory data and various cognitive processes. So really it's about this idea that we are going inside a story world and feeling like we're present in a computer-generated environment. moving on to Brenda Laurel has talked about VR as a medium in which the human sensorium is surrounded by or immersed in stimuli that's partially or wholly generated and represented by artificial means, and in which the imagery is displayed from the point of view of an individual participant, even as he or she moves around. And I really like this definition because it stresses that immersion. And it's a definition that can be applied to all sorts of different VR experiences, from 360 video right through to, computer generated VR, where you might actually be able to walk around in a story world and touch and move things. Lastly, Gerald talks about it being about VR being psychologically being in a different place than where you're physically located, which might be a replica of the real world or an imaginary world that does not exist and could never exist. So, it's not just about sort of, I guess, photographically real environments, but also imagined spaces or computer generated spaces that take us places that we've never, we'll never be able to see in real life. So all of these definitions stress presence and immersion as key concepts. Just looking at how you can experience VR. So my preferred method is through the head-mounted display, which you can see there in the photo on the left, where you're fully sort of cut off from the real world and surrounded by some sort of synthetic environment. But just acknowledging that there's also dome screens, which you can see there on the right, or cave environments down below that have that sort of, I guess people look upon these other ways of viewing VR as offering a more communal experience where you can kind of view something with other people. However, that's really changing now. Within the headset, you have a lot more communal sort of experiences in that you might exist in there with a whole bunch of avatars and places like VR chat and other environments. So just quickly looking at the history of storytelling, I hope you can read that up there. A bit smaller down here, but so just to acknowledge that VR is a medium that's been sort of developing for a long time, has a complex history. And in the 20th century, there's lots of experiments and non-commercial products that were launched. Some examples are sort of Sega's Virtual Boy for gaming in 1995, or lots of immersive theater experiments that were took place in the 1990s. So from this sort of background, we get to where we are today in terms of narrative-based VR, which wasn't really possible until what some people have called this third wave in the 21st century. And a key development in that respect was 2012, the Kickstarter funding campaign to develop the prototype, I guess, of the Oculus Rift head-mounted display, which many of you will recall began with a crowdfunding campaign, which generated $2.4 million in the US with pledges from all sorts of enthusiasts. And then, of course, that sort of snowballed, and 2 years later, the prototype, which turned into the DK2, was acquired by Facebook for $2 billion US. And this sort of set off, everyone wanting to get into VR and all sorts of speculation and the hype around where we were going in terms of storytelling. And this really is a result of lots of advances in smartphone technologies and other technologies that makes it possible to have this headset on a consumer level for us to watch VR in the home. So such headsets really entered the mass market in 2015. And now, of course, we have the Meta Quest and, Apple Vision Pro and different price points, but really it's something that's a bit more accessible in the mainstream. So back around 2015, 2016, we start to see VR experiences appearing in film festivals and in other venues all around the world. New Frontiers at the Sundance Film Festival had for a long time had a focus on new technologies, but then you have other places like Venice, South by Southwest, Tribeca Film Festivals, all sort of running these side projects in VR. And this continues. And a lot of interest from film companies like 20th Century Fox and Disney were really investing in VR and setting up lots of companies. We had lots of famous film directors like Doug Liman and Catherine Bigelow making VR films. So a lot of excitement in VR. And of course, now some of those early companies have sort of folded because VR, I guess, hasn't quite delivered the return on investment that people thought it might. But still, we have lots of creators in this space and lots of new work being made that's a continual process of experimentation. So just to talk a bit about cinematic virtual reality. So this is the book that I published in 2021. And I'd come across this term a lot, cinematic virtual reality, and done a lot of reading about it. And it was a term used a lot in industry and in academia. And it continues, I think, to be used a lot in academia, less so in industry. But Sud Hermini identified an early use of this term by the practitioner Félix Lajeunesse, who referred to some of his documentary work as cinematic virtual reality experiences in 2015. So maybe that was the first time it was mentioned, I'm not quite sure. But it's taken up, and it was used in early context as often a way to differentiate between something that was wholly computer generated and a bit more interactive. So cinematic virtual reality sometimes is often referred to as film VR or live action VR, and contrasted with that sort of more traditional notions of VR, game engine produced VR. John Mateer wrote a very influential article about it as well, in which he compared it to media with the same sort of levels of fidelity as feature film. So we had it sort of used to describe really high-end work that had been filmed with cameras. But there's a lot of different definitions, so just making that point, that it sort of generally seems to refer to works that have limited interactivity, sometimes 360 video, pre-rendered video, where you can't affect the story. So the term cinematic, perhaps it's not only just references this sort of image quality, high image quality, and filming with a camera, but also has sort of references to the sort of narrative format that starts with, a beginning, middle, and end, and plays out to a fixed conclusion, a bit like a traditional film. Okay, keep moving. So just moving on to talk about some current storytelling trends that, again, referring to this second book. I noted when I was going through and looking at the vast majorities of work that had been screening at lots of different film festivals in Australia and in other places, that there's this continued popularity of those works offering 3 degrees of freedom, so 360 video, where you can sort of put the headset on and you can swivel around and look around you, look up and down, but you can't really interact with the story beyond that, so it's completely pre-rendered. But it's quite good because it's easy to distribute and easy to download onto your headset. And I think this is part of the reason why it's continuously popular, because you can get it out there to audiences in a way that's not quite as easy with works offering 6 degrees of freedom. So these might be works that are running on game engines where you can actually walk around, touch things, move things around, and thus have a bit more opportunity to interact and perhaps affect the story that's unfolding. There's lots of location-based installations where you actually have to go to a physical location where you might be, have 6 degrees of freedom, but it's within a predefined space where there's objects that you're actually physically touching. So these works don't travel very well. You have to go to, certain locations, and they're very hard to actually see. Especially as an Australian, I feel like sometimes I'm out of the loop because I'm distant from a lot of stuff that's going on in other places. But that's the challenge, I think, with VR, and it continues. Just in the last year or so, I've noticed a real growth in mixed reality works, and I was lucky enough to go to the Venice Immersive at the Venice Film Festival last year, and I noticed there were lots of mixed reality works, so works that are blending augmented reality and virtual reality. And often, there's an example there in the picture on the right. This was a work called Turbulence, Jamais Vu, where you physically sat down at a desk. And should we enable captions?
Yep.
Yep, that seems reasonable. Oh yes, don't ask. Good. So one thing about the new generation of headsets, like the Quest, is they've got really good what they call pass-through technology. So there's a camera on it that can actually see the world around you. And so people are using that in these mixed reality works. So they're not only offering you something in your headset, but they might be using what the camera can see and projecting it back at you. So it's a really exciting time, I think, where there's lots of different types of projects that are utilizing VR out there, and so lots of different approaches to storytelling that people are using with those technologies. Just that one there is another great example of a work that, it's difficult to travel because it's got, a desk and all these props and things that go with it. So again, the challenge for VR and for seeing these works is getting access. So I move through my notes here. What I found when I was looking at VR is that predominantly we can still observe a dominance of linear narrative structures. So there's been a lot of discussion, a lot of research into interactivity and how we might allow people to interact with story and be involved in the unfolding of story. But nonetheless, most VR experiences that I've come across are linear. So the ending, the beginning, it's predetermined. So when I talk about linear, I'm talking about where narrative material is presented in an audio that's controlled by the work's author. So this is a key feature of the 360-degree cinematic virtual reality format, but it also extends to works with game-like interactive devices. These are stories that generally seem to still be informed by Aristotelian patterns of narrative. So plots that are driven by cause and effect. Something happens that then leads to something else happening and repeats until you get to the end of the work. And often attempting to create an experience of catharsis for the interactor. And Mary Law Ryan, who's written a lot about interactive digital narrative, calls these top-down systems of narrative. By that, she means where the player's progression or the user's progression is a journey along a path that's already traced and leads to fixed destinations or to several destinations in the case of, work that you can sort of choose. You've got branching narratives, but nonetheless, it's predetermined how those are going to end. So there's limited authorial control of the narrative that's handed to the user or the viewer. And one can observe continued tensions between interactivity and the delivery of a coherent narrative in VR, which has been a key challenge of people working in the area of interactive digital narrative. So Aylett and Luchart have described this problem as the narrative paradox, observing that as users are given more freedom to influence a narrative, the harder it becomes to craft a story with definitive plot elements, if people can kind of go around and do whatever they want. VR live theatre or VR video games with open worlds offer an opportunity for what Ryan would call more bottom-up narrative systems, and maybe also AI might assist with this in the future, but I don't think we're quite there yet. Approaches to narration. So one thing I've noticed is the use of voiceover narration is very common in VR filmmaking, in fiction, and this sort of connects with filmmaking more generally and documentary filmmaking in particular, where we're sort of exploring past events or past experiences, and that voiceover allows us to sort of gain insights into what we're seeing. But a lot of VR experiences also feature direct address. So maybe that voiceover is speaking to the viewer directly, addressing them personally, or you have actually a physically represented person that's addressing you when you're inside this world with the headset on. So you're recognized as being there within the story world, and people are actually trying to communicate with you. Some of the research that I did into narration, I considered this through the lens of focalization, which you might be familiar with if you're into literary scholarship or film scholarship. It's a concept that comes from Gerald Genette in 1980, where he talked about the position or perspective from which a story is told. And he sort of takes into account the point of view, so the position in which you see the story, but also the presentation of information that relates to a particular character's experience and understanding within the diegesis. So I would argue that VR works commonly feature what Genette calls internal focalization, in which events are seen from the point of view of a specific character that are in the story world. But more specifically, I would observe that character is you. So you're seeing through your own eyes in the headset, and you are central to, the way that the story unfolds. But this is complicated because not only are you seeing through your own eyes, but the information that you're getting and the perspective is also shaped by the characters, and often there's a protagonist within the story, and you might be hearing their voiceover. So it's sort of like a dual process, I would argue, where there's sort of two focalizers. There's you with your headset on, taking in everything that's unfolding around you, but there's also a character in there that might be sort of guiding you through the experience. Okay. And I want to just demonstrate that in action so you can sort of get a sense of what I'm talking about here. So first, we'll just watch a couple of minutes out of On the Morning You Wake to the End of the World. This is a experience that offers you 6 degrees of freedom, so you can kind of move around a little bit within the world. And it's a story about, you'll recall in Hawaii some years ago, there was that missile alert that was sent out by accident, and everyone thought they had 15 minutes or so before they were going to be blown to pieces. And there was a mass scrambling before they found out that it was actually just a drill or an accidental text message that they all got. So this documentary explores that. So we'll just watch a couple of minutes of that.
It says "Ikava mamua, ikava mahope," which means the time in front of you and the time behind you. But kava mamua, the time in front of you,
I should just explain this is a walkthrough that someone's put up on YouTube.
And the time behind you, kava mahope, means the time that comes after or the future. And so one of the things that's kind of written into our understanding of time and space is that we always back into the future facing the past.
We have so many beautiful sunrises here, but the sunrise was so unusual and so exceptional that Bruce said, I've got to go get the good camera and photograph it. And so there was that kind of recording of the sunrise on that day that was noticed by so many people. It was beautiful, but it was flaming and it was ominous all at the same time.
I was born and raised in Hawaii. This has been my home for my entire life. I was excited to go into work Saturday. I was just finished getting ready and my phone alarm went off and I'm thinking, oh, it's gonna be like a flood alert. We get those a lot. But I looked down at it and I froze. Like I looked at it and I could not believe what I was looking at.
Okay, that's probably enough of that one, I think. You sort of get the idea there. So hopefully that's sort of, this dual focalization. So you're watching, you've got the headset on, you're looking around, and so you're sort of seeing what you would see as if you were in the environment yourself as a sort of an observer of the scene. But you're hearing this voiceover that's very much aligning you with the perspective of each of those sort of other characters that experience this event. So there's sort of, it's complex because we're in the environment, in the story world ourselves and seeing with our own eyes, I think. And that's something really quite different to filmmaking, traditional filmmaking and other media where you're outside. Now, I'll just try and get out of this without shutting everything down. Aha, good. I want to show you another example now. Yeah, and I'm going to show you another one of those. So this is for the project Goliath, playing with reality. And just to tell you a bit about this experience, this one, again, it offers you 6 degrees of freedom, and it has a lot of sort of gameplay little elements inserted within a linear narrative. And it's a project that explores the many realities of a man named Goliath who suffers from schizophrenia and spent years in a psychiatric institution, and then found solace and a way forward really through playing online multiplayer games. And so his gaming is part of his story, and then they use sort of gaming within the VR experience. But I want to just look at this clip and then come back to this idea of focalization, but also talk a bit more about narration and narrators. Let's just watch a couple of minutes of this one. Again, it's another playthrough.
I had to be assessed and get the right medication in me. Clozapine. It's an antipsychotic. Strongest oral antipsychotic in the planet. They used to just churn that stuff out to people. You get hungry. Get fat. It just makes me grow like, That's how you do it. Completely knocks you out.
I see you're getting more comfortable in this place. You're getting the hang of it. It does get easier, predictable even. But are you still in two places at once? From the outside, you seem like someone who's doing something very peculiar. Fighting thin air.
Perhaps that's a good enough place to stop there. So what I think is interesting about this one is that it sort of plays on this idea of multiple realities to question and what virtual reality is. So you'll note there were two different narrators. There was Goliath himself, who speaks in the way a traditional documentary subject might speak in a traditional film, in that he's not really addressing you personally, but he's sort of narrating the scenes that you're seeing. But then you've got this other female narrator who's voiced by Tilda Swinton, who does address you directly and is not really part of that story world at all. She's someone that sort of is outside of it and is the link to you as a person, and just reminds you that you're in a VR experience and that this is a different reality. So going back to Jeanette, I thought this was very interesting, putting to one side this idea of focalization, to think about voice and voiceover and the voice of the narrator. And so he uses two different terms, that a voiceover can be homodiegetic, so that is coming from within the story world. And we see that there with Goliath, that he's visualized, we can see him and we know who's talking. But then there's also heterodiegetic narrators who are non-visualized and are recounting a story from some position outside of the story. So it's a story they don't take part in. And we see that with, shall I go back to the slide? Yeah, good idea, sorry. We see that with the Tilda Swinton's voice. So she's outside of the story. So again, we've got sort of two different layers here in this VR experience at once, which I think is very complex. We've got in that first person address where she's addressing us personally. So it sort of gives you an example of an interesting way to think about voiceover, but also another example of that dual focalization, that you're in the world and you're the one that's experiencing this, and you're playing the game that you could see in that clip there where you're sort of trying to blow up pills that are flying towards you. But there's also another person's point of view who's informing the experience. So just returning to my slide, what I took away, what I want to take away from these two examples is this idea that meaning is constructed by a spectator or a user who's really positioned on the stage or within the story world, that everything that you are hearing and the people that you are seeing really is a result of your positioning within that world and how you're interacting with the various story elements. So how can we, I guess my question with this is, how can we write for VR in a way that really takes advantage of these affordances and these differences from other forms of screen media? So I want to consider further the notion of being on a stage. So mise en scène, for those of you that have come from film studies background, will be quite familiar with this notion. It describes a whole bunch of different aspects of, film's formal elements, setting, costumes, lighting, and staging. So how you organize these to create meaning within a screen work. But I would argue that when we talk about mise en scène for VR, we have to rethink this. So particularly in the area of setting, that it's sort of a spatialized 360-degree setting where things are unfolding in various locations around a viewer or a user who's central to the scene. And we have to rethink staging in terms of we're not just concerned with the placement of the characters or the actors and the movement and around a space, but we're also thinking about the positioning of that, the user within the space as a character or someone that's interacting with those other story agents, and someone who's potentially performing themselves, being asked to do specific things within the VR environment. So how can we think about this further? So I would argue that one way to approach this is to think about environmental storytelling that might perhaps provide a roadmap for spatial storytelling or a way to reconsider mise en scène for VR. So just to talk a bit about what environmental storytelling is. So this was a term that was first used by Don Carson, a Disneyland theme park designer, who talked about environmental storytelling as a way of describing the infusion of story elements into physical spaces. So this storytelling approach, it relies heavily on users exploring and discovering the narrative by interpretation of non-verbal elements placed in or built into the environment, which can allude to something that's happened or something that's occurred. The game theorist Henry Jenkins expanded on this in 2004 when he wrote an article that was concerned with the status of video games as a narrative medium. And he argued that discussions around narrative in the context of video games were conducted with a limited conception of what a narrative contained, what it was concerned with. So moving away from the rules and explorations associated with classical storytelling, he argued for consideration of, quote, spatial exploration over causal event chains, which seek to balance the competing demands of narrative and spectacle, end quote. So he labeled this environmental storytelling. So his key argument is that game designers don't simply tell stories, they design worlds and they sculpt spaces. So given the interactive narrative of VR, the interactive nature of VR narratives, which draw upon user agency and participation as a means of immersion in a story world, and at a very minimum, that participation involves sort of swiveling your head around to look around the environment and see what's going on. I think the concept of environmental storytelling provides a useful lens through which to consider the impact of design and spatiality on user experience of a narrative in the VR context. So while VR experiences are not exactly the same as games, one can observe that there's overlap between the two as storytelling media in that they both involve spatialized 3D worlds. And when examining these worlds of VR experience, one might therefore question the way that environmental features such as objects and settings provide narrative information, but more importantly, allow the user to engage with the story world, to piece together this information. Smith and Warch describe environmental storytelling as a staging space where environmental properties can be interpreted as a meaningful whole furthering the narrative of a game. So this definition emphasizes the holistic nature of designing an experience where the environment and the story are inexplicably linked. So as with Jenkins' description of embedded narratives, Hapgood and al., they describe a mode of storytelling that invites interpretation of situations and meaning according to players' views and experiences. So game spaces in which the player is fundamentally invested and immersed because of their interaction with the environment. So there's really an emphasis here on environmental design as a means to engage the user in the active construction of narrative. And I would argue that this calls for a reconsideration of mise-en-scène to really consider that user interaction. So I just want to drill into Henry Jenkins' ideas about environmental storytelling a bit further before I move on to showing you a few examples. So for Jenkins, environmental storytelling fosters the creation of immersive narrative experiences that can manifest themselves in 4 different ways, he contends. And just a quote there for him, he talks about spatial stories that can evoke pre-existing narrative associations. They can provide a staging ground where narrative events are enacted, and they may embed narrative information within their mise-en-scène or provide resources for emergent narratives. And I want to drill in my examples below into this idea of narrative events being enacted by the user. I'm not going to talk so much about emergent narratives, this idea of narratives that could be created by the user within a space that don't have sort of a fixed ending, just because I haven't seen too many examples of those to date. And we don't really see emergent narratives really in narrative-based VR, except for really open world games as at the moment. And I note that Jenkins' concepts call for a fair amount of interactivity. So considering the spectrum of VR works, some of these environmental storytelling works may or may not be, techniques may or may not be enabled, but let's have a look at some case studies and see what we can draw out of them. So first up, I want to talk about The Man Who Couldn't Leave. This is a documentary work. All of the case studies I'm going to show reasonably quickly, they're all documentary works, and I just want to acknowledge that this is a real focus of activity for virtual reality, mainly I think due to the production costs that would be involved with producing fiction films and just the lack of a business model to get return on investment for that thus far. But there's a huge amount of documentary VR, and a lot of this includes sort of dramatic recreations of past events. So The Man Who Couldn't Leave, it's a 35-minute experience that tells the story of inmates at Taiwan's, this is hard to pronounce, Liandao prison on Green Island during the White Terror era. So a declaration of martial law was declared in Taiwan on the 19th of May in 1949, and civilians and political dissenters were suppressed and repressed by the Chinese Nationalist Party at the time, leading to occurrences of mass murder and imprisonment. And this continued until martial law was lifted in 1987. So the director, Seeing Chen, she's created this virtual reality experience that draws upon real documents recounting the experiences of dissidents that were imprisoned in the 1950s on Green Island. And she's come up with a fictionalized story of 2 characters, AQN, an inmate who survived his stay in the prison, and his friend A Ching, who was executed. So this is a VR experience that was commissioned by the country's National Human Rights Museum, and it really gives you an understanding of that White Terror era, which is important for the new generation in Taiwan and audiences more broadly. It's a stereoscopic work. It's 360 video, so it has got that limited interactivity where you can sort of swivel around and look, but you can't really touch anything and you can't walk around. So this is the first shot that you see, this sort of landscape where you're out in the ocean, and you have to swivel around to sort of take in where you are, and you discover the island off to one side, and you sort of get physically acclimatized in this environment. So the camera's positioned at this sort of human vantage point, so it matches, you know, gives you this feeling of what it might be like if you were actually there because of the position of that camera. And it's quite photographically real, the whole experience. not too long into the experience, you move into the inside of the prison, and you're inside this wooden cell, and you meet the protagonist, AQN, who's now an elderly man. He enters and walks towards you and talks to you directly. And you realize at that point that this is sort of a wax, I think it's a wax scene, like all the other figures, they don't move, but he does. And he talks to you, telling you he's been waiting for you to arrive. So you're offered a first-person engagement with this character that feels somewhat personal, something akin to a guided tour of the real location. And then you can watch and listen and swivel around as he moves around the cell and describes life as it was when he was in prison there, and tells you about his friend, A Ching, who's one of the people sitting there behind. So you're really getting considerable opportunity to learn about the life of the prisoners by studying the mise-en-scène in this scene, the objects, the clothing, and the placement of characters in relation to each other. And so it could be considered an example of embedded narrative, returning to Henry Jenkins, where narrative information is drawn from the spaces and artifacts that you're looking at. But it's really spectating something a bit more like traditional film viewing, that you can't move or you can't touch anything. Later on in the experience, there's a lot of really quite theatrical scenes, such as this one, really theatrical lighting. Like, I think the people that produced this came from theatre backgrounds. You see the character A Ching suspended there by rope and other prisoners behind him. What's interesting about this scene is you hear sounds coming from behind you, and you turn around and you see the persecutors sort of sitting in a box, and you sort of have to swivel around between one action and the action going on here that you can see in this particular shot. So in this way, the work seeks to engage the viewer's whole body to comprehend what's going on in the scene by placing the action in sort of opposite quadrants. So I think it's really strategic staging of the action around the viewer. So the placement within the scene of the viewer has been really strategically and carefully choreographed by the makers, alongside the movement of the actors in space, to account for the spectator on the stage. But of course, environmental storytelling techniques are quite limited, seeing as it's an experience offering 3 degrees of freedom. And it has a linear story that plays out to a pre-rendered conclusion. There's some voiceover, some letters that are read by one character to another that informs the experience. But otherwise, it's very much, you're taking in what you can see. Moving on to my next example. So this is an experience called Stay Alive, My Son, that was made in 2022. And it includes game elements. It offers 6 degrees of freedom, so you can sort of walk around within the scenes, and you can sort of touch things, get close to things, and you can pick up some things. But it tells the story of one man's survival in Cambodia during the time of the Khmer Rouge. It's based on an autobiographical novel by Pin Yathe that was also called Stay Alive, My Son. And it presents a personal account of his experience of the Khmer Rouge's arrival in Phnom Penh when he was 33 years old, to him being put into a concentration camp with his family, and then his escape into Thailand more than 2 years later. And during that time, he lost all of his family members and was forced to abandon his 6-year-old son in order to survive himself and for his son to survive. So it's a very harrowing narrative that begins in modern-day France, where the 80-year-old Yathe now lives. And you're invited in this scene, as you'll see, to enter into his home where he speaks to you directly. And you can kind of wander around his home and look at the different things that he has there. So you can get details of his life from the mise-en-scène. But not long after, you actually have a bit of a bodily transfer, and you become Yathe, and you kind of look down and see that you now have his hands. And the rest of the experience unfolds where you are retracing his footsteps as he escapes from the concentration camp. And he is a narrator throughout, so you're hearing, his thoughts and him recounting the story, as well as sort of experiencing it firsthand. So while we have a first-person perspective of the unfolding events and game-like interactive possibilities, there is a real reliance on voiceover to contextualize what is seen in relation to the overall narrative, which is linear. And, you get to play with a few things, but it plays out to a predetermined conclusion. So you wind up in these sort of quite harrowing environments that represent this time in the concentration camp. And this particular scene, I'm guided by haptic feedback in my hand controllers to sort of move in a direction down this sort of cavernous space. And I'm encouraged to pick up a torch off the ground. And you then can take the torch and sort of investigate the scene. And you have to get quite close up to things in order to illuminate them because it's a very dim torch. And this really, you can see here, you shine the torch and you see, you know, human bones and blood and all sorts of carnage. And it's very effective, I think, you know, because you have to go and discover this yourself. And the director of the piece, Victoria Boussis, she described this, and I'll just quote her. She says, "The viewer uses the torch to find artifacts and objects, but it is also an essential element of their narrative progression and education about Cambodian history and culture. In fact, the flashlight also invoked a feeling of exploration of the world and details based on actual places." So returning to Hapgood and others' description of environmental storytelling as a mode that invites interpretation of situations and meaning according to players' views and experience, we can really see here that you're bringing your own experience into this harrowing space, and that active exploration, I think, creates this sense that you're really invested in this space and the story, more so than you might get from a traditional film viewing. So I would argue that the interactive nature of this VR experience gives rise to your emotional response that's really tied to the action of movement, discovering objects, ingesting information. So although this is managed within the framework of a reasonably traditional narrative arc, so explorable spaces, I can note, have boundaries. So there's a predetermined narrative that you have to keep activating to move forward, and you can't just explore anywhere you want. So it's very tightly sort of authored what it is that you can explore and what you can't. Okay, moving on. So my next case study is The Changing Same, episode 1. So this is a magic realist project that actually you can watch it in 6 degrees of freedom and 3 degrees of freedom formats. And it explores the role of American history in shaping current social and cultural conditions in the United States. It's an episodic narrative, and it simulates time travel to really go back and forth across 400 years of history of racial inequality and make links between mistreatments of the past and the present. And it's inspired by the true story of Claude Neal, a man who was falsely accused of rape and murder and then lynched in Mariana in Florida in 1934. You might describe this piece as a speculative documentary in that it's sort of putting you in the position of stuff that could happen, while also making reference to stuff that has happened. So it starts in a forest in Mariana, as you can see in this shot here, and there's a rectangular wooden ranch, and you meet your guide through the experience, Lamar Wheaton, who's sort of based on a real person, who sits upon the front porch here. And so he makes eye contact with you and introduces himself and tells you that here in Mariana you can experience the past and the present. So there's no voiceover in this experience at all. It's just direct address and events that unfold around you. So you're really experiencing things like a simulation. In the following scene, you're sort of traveling through time. So that scene sort of breaks up and you're literally going through this space where there's all bits and pieces of objects around you. And you can see here floating around lots of architectural objects, historical venues such as the Cotton Club and the Apollo Theatre. So these are venues that champion Black musicians in the early and mid 20th century. The sets of staircases, upturned police cars, and a series of monuments that recall key moments in the history of the revolutionary Black Power movement. So I see here another example of meaning being embedded in objects, to return to Henry Jenkins. You sort of exist in a time-space vacuum here, that you're not in any particular place, but you've got to piece together some sense of a narrative from all of these objects and architectural structures that are passing you by. Before you find yourself in the next scene in a suburban neighborhood and you're with Lamar and you're just sort of hanging out there for a moment before a police car pulls up and an altercation happens. There's no real cause for arrest, but nonetheless, Lamar is arrested. And at this point, you realize that you have also been cast in this unfolding drama as a fellow, as Lamar's sort of sidekicks, and you've also been arrested. So you find yourself in the backseat of a police car with Wheaton sitting next to you in handcuffs. And he talks about his anger of being arrested for no good reason. Moving on to the next scene, you find yourself in a police station with a lawyer. And I just want to play this scene and then talk about it in terms of enacting narratives. So you as a sort of character within a narrative. Let's see.
When I call your name, stand up. Wilson. Toby. JT. Amos. Hunter. Hunter.
Well, if I had to guess, I'd say it looks like you're getting the better part of this journey.
Hi, I'm attorney Sarah Lopez, but you can call me Sarah. I've been selected to defend you on your felony assault charges. Hope you're doing okay. Listen, these are some serious charges. A Class D felony assault carries a 3 to 7 year sentence in this state. But we can make this all go away. The judge is prepared to offer you a suspended sentence with a 2-year probation if you take the plea deal.
Okay, that was a playthrough from when I watched it and videotaped it, so my own one. And you can see me sort of looking around there to see what's going on while this woman is talking to me. And so it sort of becomes apparent in this scene that you can sort of get away on a good behavior bond if you then, you know, Lamar gets arrested. So it sort of sets up this idea that people get trapped in the justice system through, you know, no fault of their own. But it's quite confronting that you've got this person talking to you and you really do feel like you're in a simulation rather than, you know, it's your own experience. It's not someone else's experience. So one could consider this scene in particular as a space where narrative is enacted, as Jenkins writes about, where the user or the viewer exists as a passive character within the drama, but yet they are central to the drama and they're experiencing their experience within the scene is what is centered and what's foregrounded. So this really invites interpretation of the situation and meaning according to the player's views and experience, but seeks to put the user into the center of the work. So my agency here is limited. I can choose my viewing direction. I can take a few steps in space and move around, but I've got no ability to influence the unfolding narrative, yet I'm central to it. So overall in this one can observe the existence of classical narrative storytelling elements within this episode, in that you've got the introduction of Wheaton as a protagonist, you've got sort of a chain of cause and effect of events that happen, getting arrested, and then you've got a very fixed conclusion of events here. But I would argue that environmental storytelling approaches are drawn on to transmit narrative information related to Wheaton's subjective experience of Mariana and to make the user really central to the unfolding of action. Just got one more example. Oops. There we go. So Fragile Home. So this is a 30-minute mixed reality work. It's an installation work that I saw when I was at Venice Immersive last year. And through mixed reality, the work shows you a gradual transformation of a physical space that you're standing in into the dwelling of a Ukrainian family and explores their experience from a peaceful past to experience of war. So it's sort of giving you a first-hand experience in the home, I guess, of a Ukrainian family. So before I move on, I've just got a trailer for the work. I'll just play a couple of minutes of that so you get a bit more of a sense of how it works.
My jsme se rozhodli pro formát smíšené reality, který je relativně nový. Je zajímavý v tom, že se vám v tom headsetu kombinuje vlastně realita kolem vás, takže obývák vlastně diváka, ideálně u něj doma. A vlastně vy v té helmě můžete vidět to reálné okolí, které se vám doplňuje těmi digitálními objekty a tak trochu se převléká vlastně z vašeho klasického pokoje na ten ukrajinský pokoj a můžete tam zažívat vlastně různé věci, které se ukrajinským lidem od začátku války děly. Takže nám vlastně přišlo tohle jako takové nejlepší skloubení nějaké nové technologie a nějakého inovativního přístupu.
Zelené je žito za selo.
А ще мені було дуже складно.
There. Gives you a sense of what it looks like, and I've got a couple more pictures. So yeah, there's an actual physical room, and you enter that room, you take your shoes off, and you're alone in the room, and a voice out of a speaker encourages you to look around the room and think about your own home while you're doing so. And you can see there's pictures on the wall, there's a couch, there's various objects there. And then you're instructed to put on your VR headset, and AR, sort of these leaves floating in space that you can see in the top, the right picture there, appear. And as you move towards these leaves, the sort of virtual reality image appears and replaces the real room. So you can sort of move around and touch things, and there's actually things there, but it's not what you see. What you see is sort of a Ukrainian room. And then you have a series of interactions with objects, reactive elements. So for example, you can pat the cat that's on the couch, or you can pick up a newspaper off the table, and it's obviously what you see is determined by the virtual reality. There's some songs, but there's no voiceover. So there's nothing but you in this space. And there's a dinner table set for a feast. And throughout the experience, there's pictures on the wall that sort of change and reveal to you that something is going on. So suddenly, things have gone a bit dark. The images on the newspaper tell you there's a political, very bad situation. And the cat sort of guides you around the room. It jumps onto the windowsill and you follow, and then there's an explosion that the house has actually been bombed, and the wall blows out, leaving the pile of rubble. More items appear in the wrecked home for you to find and peruse. It suggests a process of rebuilding and the resilience of the people that lived there. So there's a linear narrative at play here of cause and effect and a predetermined ending, but you really are finding it through your exploration of the space. There's no voiceover to guide you, and only direct interaction with objects. And I found this to be a really powerful use of virtual reality, where you were getting that firsthand experience of an event that had happened, and you were central to the event. Okay, so just wrapping up. So these 4 case studies show really different approaches to narration and a spectrum of possibilities for user interaction in virtual reality. But each work responds to the spectator's positioning as present within the story world or on the stage of the story in different ways, considering the strategic choreography of action and interaction in 360-degree space. So reflecting on these case studies, I would argue that the concept of environmental storytelling provides a means to foreground spectator positioning and interaction within a VR story world, because it calls for the narrative to become discoverable in some way or another. So we see this in the examples offering 3 degrees of freedom, where you've got to turn around, and swivel to discover what's going on. Or in the works with 6 degrees of freedom, where you have the ability to move closer, to pick up objects, to make sense of them. And this becomes an embodied activity for the active spectator. So one can say then that environmental storytelling as a concept calls for a rethinking of mise en scène to reconsider the spectator or the user on the stage of the story. So choreographing user movement alongside that of observable story agents is critical. Many contemporary VR works would appear to adopt environmental storytelling techniques within the confines of a linear narrative with causal event chains. So while also adopting narrative techniques common to film production, such as the use of voiceover narration. We've seen this in the clips from Goliath, from On the Morning You Wake. Voiceover is also present in 2 of those other case studies we just looked at then. Meanwhile, the changing same or fragile home rely on direct address from characters or spectators or direct interaction with objects to offer something a bit more like a simulation where something's unfolding live. So it's not reframing past events, but offering us a present tense experience into which we're inserted. So I'm thinking a lot more about this. It's sort of an ongoing research project about how all these different approaches to narration affect us and give us a different experience. And I'm wondering, could this be the true potential of VR to sort of give us that present tense experience? So just to finish, I'll just state by saying that VR projects are diverse and they have a variety of goals. But it's hoped that in this presentation, I've provided a bit of food for thought as to the medium's specificity and what it does differently to traditional film and some of the avenues for future exploration and research of VR as a narrative format. So yeah, thanks very much for listening.